You're too young to be on that bridge. You're too young to be standing on the edge. Too young to be alone with the rain. You're too young. You just wanna be understood. You just wanna be guiltless.
Good morning. Welcome to the second panel of the conference. I am Germinare K from the Universidad de Warwick at CIDE, and it's a pleasure to moderate this panel. In this panel, we're going to listen to Andrew Zimmerman, who is a professor of German history at George Washington University. He has earned his PhD from the University of California, San Diego in 1998. He's the author of Anthropology and Anti-Humanism in Imperial Germany, and Alabama in Africa, Booker T. Washington, the German Empire, and the globalization of the New South. His research focuses on modern Germany, the United States, and West Africa. He's working on a project tentatively titled Slaves and Soldiers in the Red and Black Atlantic, a transnational and revolutionary history of the American Civil War. Then we're going to listen to Gurminder K, is that right? Who's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. She has undergraduate and postgraduate degrees from the University of Sussex and the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's the author, among others, of Rethinking Modernity, Post-Colonialism and Sociological Imagination, which won the British Sociological Association Philip Abraham Memorial Prize for Best First Book in Sociology in 2008. And her research addresses how, within sociological understandings of modernity, the experiences and claims of non-European others have been rendered invisible to the dominant narratives and analytical frameworks of sociology. These works are going to be discussed by Hector Vega, who got his PhD from the New School for Social Research, where he wrote a dissertation comparing the interaction of the metrical system in Mexico and the US. Dr. Vela has co-edited volumes on Robert Elias and Durkheim, Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. His main research interests are in the field of historical sociology, and he's a proponent of the historical sociology of knowledge. And finally, Alan Morsi-Gelais, who's a professor at the International Relations Division at CIDE. He obtained his PhD from the Humboldt University of Berlin. Alvaro has published on several topics, including the reception of Max Weber in the Americas. Together with Eduardo Weiss, he has edited a forthcoming book on the interpretations of Max Weber. We have 20 minutes for each of the presentations, 10 minutes for the discussions, and then we're going to open the floor for questions.
So thank you first for the invitation to come and speak here today, and I very much hope that it will be a pleasure. But as somebody who's not only not a Weberian, but also somebody who thinks that Weber's influence in the social sciences is quite pernicious and needs to be reduced, not reproduced, I feel somewhat like I've walked into a lion's den here, and I hope I make it out of here alive. My talk is about historical sociology, what's problematic. Oh, a bit closer, okay. So my talk's about historical sociology, what's problematic with the Weberian dominance within comparative historical sociology of the ideal types methodology, and a suggestion for connected sociologies as a more productive way to deal with the problems that we face today. From its inception, the main issue of classical historical sociology was, as Eisenstadt suggests, to understand the peculiar qualitative and descriptive characteristics of pre-modern European and non-European societies in relation to, and especially in contrast with, modern, initially European societies. For Weber, for example, the starting point of what has been called European exceptionalism led him to examine social and economic processes in other parts of the world in terms of their differences from Europe and as obstacles to the development of capitalism locally. I've argued elsewhere that the situation is not substantially different in the case of Marx. In both, there has been little to no consideration of how the already existing historical connections between parts of the world might be implicated in developments that were perceived otherwise as endogenous and independent processes originating in Europe and then exported to other parts of the world. Insofar as each believes capitalism to have world historical significance, the global world, prior to the diffusion of capitalism, is argued to have no significance in determining the form of that capitalism. The failure to recognize prior global connections, or to regard them as significant in the development of capitalism, substantively, is about the elision of colonialism and empire in the development of capitalism. This elision is strongly associated with the methodology of ideal types, which has, in effect, come to define comparative historical sociology. Substance and method are connected via the doctrine of value relevance, which determines both the selection of the topics for study and the appropriate methodology of conducting any study. Empire and colonialism were not value-relevant concerns for Europeans, while ideal types insulate theoretical constructions from the intrusion of other considerations which are rendered external, to be addressed separately, if at all, and not bearing on the validity of the constructs developed independently of them. Within this approach, new conceptualizations are placed alongside existing ones in a multiplication, rather than reconstruction, of theoretical constructs, which are presented as if they have no implications for previous formulations. While ideal types are always presented as in principle reformable, in light of any new evidence, after all, Weber presents them as heuristic, what seems to occur with much greater frequency, as people such as Brun and Homewood and Stewart have argued, is an attempt to justify the initial selection, rather than to account for the new material within the revised conceptual categories and explanatory frameworks. Even if we were to accept the situated character of knowledge production, and therefore allow that the idea of value relevance could be construed as no more than an acknowledgement of this situatedness, the problem would remain that new values or new concerns deriving from different situations are treated as discrete and not as requiring a revision of existing understandings, which can remain true from their specific perspectives. What I want to suggest is that the introduction of new perspectives cannot leave existing perspectives unchanged, and that what is involved in reconstruction will not just be the addition of alternative historical trajectories, but also new conceptualizations of what are presented otherwise as core concepts. For example, reconstructions of what Weber would regard as the pure types of modern capitalism, bureaucracy, etc., and not simply new accounts of historical trajectories in which these pure types are utilized. Towards the end of my talk, I'll outline in more detail the nature of an alternative reconstructive approach, which, following Sanjay Subramaniam's idea of connected histories, I call connected sociologies. My brief reference to colonialism earlier should have alerted you to the new perspectives that I'm drawing on in this critique, namely those deriving from the traditions of post-colonialism and decoloniality. One of the ways in which advocates of comparative historical sociology have addressed these critiques is to suggest that they supply additional objects for study and do not require reconstructions of core concepts nor revisions of previous histories. The question that I am concerned with here is what is it about the methodology of ideal types that sets them against reconstruction of their categories? Ideal types are presented by Weber as interpretations that can be regarded as valid despite the deviation of empirical circumstances from the processes represented within the type. Since ideal types are necessarily selective, those other circumstances can be represented within a different ideal type, which merely sits alongside other ideal types as part of the conceptual armory of interpretations that are dependent on the different purposes at hand, that is, the different value perspectives, providing the puzzles that have initiated the study. However, the extent to which an ideal type is distinguished from empirical reality, Homewood and Stewart argue, further points to the significance of an evaluative and prescriptive element that is also embodied within it. The failure to reconstruct ideal types in light of new evidence suggests not only a commitment to the theoretical construct separate from its relation to the empirical, but also a commitment to the evaluative scheme associated with it. The ideal type of European modernity, for example, is established on the basis of a selection of historical narratives that simultaneously presents a normative argument about European progress and superiority. This is a value-relevant engagement from which its ideal types have been constructed. Any criticism of that selection, in terms of significant histories that may have been omitted in the construction of the type, or that may contradict the evaluative scheme, can be deflected by arguing that what is being proposed is a new set of value-relevant concerns, together with their selective focus, but that the representations that ensue do not call into question those gathered under previous and different value-relevant concerns. To the extent that the criticism has been addressed, this has led to the development of new ideal types, multiple modernities, that sit along the existing type and evaluative scheme rather than any reconstruction of the original understanding of European modernity. A methodology of ideal types purports to separate the categories necessary for the construction of valid sociological theories from the value-relevant cultural concerns from which the theoretical gaze issues. In this way, the sociological categories that enter into ideal types are glossed as universal in their nature while being directed at particular cultural concerns. Thus, theorists of multiple modernities argue that the concepts to be used in understanding modernity can achieve a form of universalism while allowing different orientations to modernity deriving from different value-relevant interests, including the different value-relevant interests of sociologists located in other cultural settings. This separation establishes an in-principle possibility of agreement on facts and consequences, while value-relevant interests need not be resolvable as they derive from factors specific to cultures. In this way, a form of cultural relativism is admitted, while denying its significance for explanatory undertakings. That is, problems may arise within universal explanations as identified by others, such as, for example, Eurocentrism, that these problems can be attributed to culturally specific concerns which may be relevant to those subscribing to particular cultural values, but need not concern others subscribing to other cultural values. This establishes a double form of protection for European explanations, given the conflation of European cultural values with issues of universal relevance. These explanations cannot be challenged, as they constitute the facts, and any challenge does not have to be admitted, because it's held to derive from the value structures of other cultures. Interestingly, and revealing the dominance of ideal type methodology within a variety of sociological approaches, this is not only an issue within European comparative historical sociology, but it also informs much work on global sociology done from various locations around the world. The key issue for many global sociologists, unsurprisingly, appears to be an assertion of the histories and cultures neglected within the ideal type of European modernity. This is often done, however, without challenging the underlying historical narratives that maintain civilizations as distinct entities prior to European encounter and subordinates those civilizations to European encounter. While there may be critique of the airbrush narratives of European impact, this is not taken as the basis of reconstructing understandings of modernity. Rather, new ideal types of modernity of other civilizations are developed and placed alongside the existing one. This proliferation of ideal types enables the telling of other stories or other histories, but it does very little to challenge the hierarchies of the established order. The established order embodied in the grand ideal type of European modernity. It enables scholars working on and in parts of the world other than Europe and the West access to the privileges of a Euro-centered international academy, where space is found for other thinkers and episodes of history, but only if they make no difference to the stories that Europe otherwise tells of its past. However, I have also suggested that the problem relates to the concepts of pure types that enter into the construction of the more substantive ideal types applied to historical circumstances. While we may understand that colonialism and imperialism might be regarded by their European instigators as contingent phenomenon, especially perhaps by those interpreting what they believe to be their own traditions, it will also be recognized that those who had the direct experience of colonialism regarded its mechanisms to be at least as important, if not more so, in the construction of the dominant and dominating form of capitalist modernity that is otherwise being described and analysed. Thus, it's perhaps the case that capitalism presents itself in European experience as a phenomenon in part strongly associated with the emergence of free labour. But elsewhere, it would seem that its association with forced and coerced labour is equally compelling. And yet nowhere in comparative historical sociologies of modernity is the phenomenon of forced labour made central to capitalism. Equally, the diffusion of capitalism as a system of market exchanges, expressing European rights to self-ownership and the products of its free labour, occurs through occupation and possession, or dispossession. The occupation of land and colonial settlement are integral to the development of capitalism, and yet they form no part of the conceptual armoury of comparative historical sociology. The perspective of connected sociologies, in contrast, starts from a recognition that events are constituted by processes that are always broader than the selections that bound events as particular and specific to their theoretical constructs. It is inspired by the call by the historian Sanjay Subrahmanyam for connected histories, which he argues do not derive from a singular standpoint, whether that be a putatively universal standpoint, which post-colonial theorists have demonstrated as being in fact a particular standpoint linked to colonialism, or a standpoint of the generalized subaltern. Indeed, both a particular standpoint and a universal standpoint in historical sociology tend to be strongly associated with the methodology of ideal types, where constructions are derived from particular value-relevant selections. Their disagreement is over the values deemed to be relevant, not over the form of the theoretical constructs to which they give rise. To understand events in terms of ideal types is to argue that they are knowable in terms of processes represented as internal to the type. Connected sociologies, in contrast, seek to reconstruct theoretical categories and their relations and objects to create new understandings that incorporate and transform previous ones. While knowledge can never be total, the selections we make have consequences for its ordering. That ordering is always open to challenge in the light of different selections and reorderings. In the standard accounts of ideal types, the consequence is a plurality of processes that are disconnected, precisely because the function of ideal types is to separate some events and entities from others, and to represent their internal relationships, thereby making other entities and events mere contingencies from the perspective of those relations. The approach of connected sociologies is different. It recognizes a plurality of possible interpretations and selections, not as description, but as an opportunity for reconsidering what we previously thought we had known. Mere contingencies from one perspective become central features in another. This is not an argument for relativism. Relativism is something that's already implicit in standard ideal type methodology. but rather this is an argument for the reconstruction of concepts and the reinterpretation of histories in the light of that reconstruction. Put another way, and with this I'll end, engaging with different voices must move us beyond simple pluralism to make a difference to what was initially thought. Not so that we come to think the same, but that we think differently from how we had thought previously. Thank you.
Is the excuse me, is the microphone in a good place? No. Closer? Closer. Higher. How's this?
Is it working?
It's on. Maybe it's not on. Other than the fact that it's not on. Thank you. Is this? Oh. Probably this is good. Yes? All right, good. Thank you. All right, well, first of all, I want to express how grateful I am to CIDE and Colmex and to Oliver also for inviting me to this conference, and I'm very grateful to all of you for listening to my talk. Like Gurminder, I was a little worried, although no longer now, that I was going to be the only one criticizing Weber, and like Gurminder, it's going to be from a post-colonial perspective. The title of my talk is Max Weber and Universal History. So let me begin. Any discussion of Max Weber's conception of universal history must begin with the 1920 preface to his Sociology of Religion. This is the text given as the author's introduction to Talcott Parsons' 1930 English translation of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. I'm not sure how that fits into the Spanish translations, but in any case. Most striking in that preface is the almost casual manner in which Weber breezes through different spheres of cultural and social life, pronouncing the unique rationality and universal meaning of each variant of each characteristic of what he calls the West. And let me say in this talk, because I want to be very precise in my engagement with Weber, I have a lot of little mini phrases quoted from Weber, and I hope it's not too annoying if I go like this to indicate I'm using Weber's words. For longer quotes, I won't do that the whole time, but just in short. I know that poses a problem for the translation, but it's, and I apologize for that. Weber remarked on those fields one might expect from such a Eurocentric survey: science, medicine, law, history, writing, printing, and of course capitalism. He also identified a unique Western universal rationality in some unexpected fields: music, apparently it has to do with the harmony, and architecture, it has to do with the dome. Weber did not claim that these Western forms represent the highest realization of a cultural and social evolution common to all societies. He was no evolutionist. Rather, for Weber, the universality, the universelle Bedeutung of the Western version of science, music, etc., was, somewhat paradoxically, particular only to the West. The West, for Weber, is simultaneously unique and universal. Eurocentric universalism remains a central component of present-day intellectual, political, and economic life. Historians regularly, as we were just discussing, historians and other social scientists regularly derive the categories with which they analyze world history from modern European history. Sociologist George Ritzer, just to name one example, has characterized the combined and uneven development of global capitalism as, in his words, a universalizing McDonaldization. We could also think of Thomas Friedman's argument about the world being flat, for a more vulgar version of that. Rarely is a sovereign nation invaded, rarely does a powerful corporation take over and privatize a public utility or other social good without reference to some supposed universal: human rights, free markets, efficiency, and the like. Unlike these latter-day universalists, Weber was not at all coy about the specific local power political interests at work in his conception of the universal, and that's why I think it's still so worthwhile to return to Weber. Weber opens his 1920 preface by relativizing the Western universalism that he will then go on to explain. And a longer quote: "In Western civilization, and in Western civilization only, cultural phenomena have appeared which, as we like to think, lie in a line of development having universal significance and value," end of quote. The "as we like to think," in German, wie wir wenigstens wir uns gern vorstellen, as we like to think, is of particular interest. Weber suggests here that those from societies outside the West might not recognize the universal significance and value he attributes to the various spheres of European culture. Even more significantly, he suggests that those in the West recognize their cultural achievements as universal because it pleases them, we like to think, rather than because these achievements really are universal. There is a kind of relativism here, but not one that softens any commitment to the universality of the West. It simply indicates that this declaration of universality is a political decision that Weber and any other, quote, son of modern European culture would take. Who are these sons? Who is the we that recognizes, at least because they like to, the West as universal, even while knowing it is, in fact, particular? Those shaped by Protestant civilization, Weber suggests in the book. But the last paragraph of the preface offers a clue that both connects Weber to his historical context and makes sense of his kind of relativist universalism. The peculiar and unique rationality of the West rests on racial properties inherent to Europeans. Weber, to be sure, held that, quote, comparative racial neurology and psychology had not yet developed sufficiently to connect the peculiarities of the West to biological race. Weber noted that he was nonetheless, quote, inclined to think the importance of biological hereditary very great, end quote. Here and throughout his career, Weber posited a racial hierarchy that manifested itself in culture, but rested in some only vaguely defined way on biology, and particularly on biological race. This made cultural differences among civilization function like racial differences, even while for Weber, they also had a likely biological racial basis. Based on my experience, scholars of Weber in both the United States and in the Federal Republic of Germany have mostly been unwilling or unable to hear Weber's own statements attributing political and analytic importance to race. Perhaps those who define themselves as Weberians worry that Weber's own discussions of race might delegitimize a sociological theory that they still employ, or that Weber's statements might even tarnish their own work with the suspicion of racism. I harbor no such prosecutorial intent. Rather, I think we can better appreciate Weber by listening to his own words, hence the quotes, by listening to his own words and relating them to political commitments he explicitly chose and proclaimed. In Weber's day, as in our own, there were many types of racism, and the fact that Weber did not subscribe to the eugenic enthusiasms of, say, an Alfred Ploetz does not mean that he was a racial liberal in the sense that that word has been used since the Second World War. It also, however, does not mean that we can legitimately ignore the importance that Weber attached to race, and particularly to hierarchical notions of race. So, to Weber's context. Weber addressed two central and interconnected problems in many of his writings. The first was the transition from bonded to free labor in East Elbian Prussia, and the second was the nationalist reorganization of the eastern territories of the German Empire. During the 19th century, Prussian agriculture moved from a reliance on bonded to formerly free labor. In this sense, Prussia was but a local example of a much broader global phenomenon that spanned many parts of the capitalist periphery and semi-periphery, from the Americas to Russia. In all of these regions, planters, Junkers, and political authorities cooperated to devise post-emancipation labor coercive regimes that they held necessary to continue to produce such staples as cotton, sugar, wheat, and rye. Programs that these elites devised ranged from sharecropping in the southern United States, as well as racism and Jim Crow and many other things, to a variety of legal and economic restrictions in Prussia that continued well into the 20th century. The idea of these Prussian reforms, in the words of one of the reformers, Prince Karl August von Hardenberg, was to end hereditary unfreedom without repealing the system of forced labor, if you can imagine that. And that's sort of what they did for at least a century. One of the ways that Prussian agricultural workers struggled for freedom and prosperity in these new conditions was through migration. Millions of agricultural workers left the Prussian East for industrial employment in Western Germany, or migrated overseas, most often to the United States. To replace their labor, landlords turned to seasonal migrants from Polish parts of Prussia. After 1890, Prussian authorities permitted Eastern landlords to employ migrant laborers from across the Russian or Austrian borders in the parts of Prussia that those countries ruled. Poland did not have an independent political existence at this time and was divided among Austria, Russia, and Prussia. These Polish migrants, like the German workers they replaced, migrated not only because they had to work, but also to escape the poverty and confinement of the parental households in which many of these very young workers still lived. These Polish workers were mobile, not settled like the German householders they replaced. Both their mobility and their ethnicity, and what at the time was called their race, concerned Prussian authorities, who worried about Polonization of the Prussian East and pursued a project of Germanization or intercolonization. It's worth remembering that while Prussians spoke of the Polonization of their eastern provinces, these provinces had in fact been taken from Poland by military force. Well before Weber joined the Social Policy Association, well before Weber joined the organization, the Social Policy Association addressed what it regarded as the worrisome mobility and freedom of workers in Germany. In the first years of the association's existence in the early 1870s, members concerned themselves with industrial workers, in whom they detected a growing barbarization, Verwilderung, and more pointedly, a tendency towards social democracy. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, which would quickly become the largest Marxist party in the world, would be a constant concern of the Social Policy Association. The Social Policy Association would soon turn its attention to problems of rural labor. For members of the Social Policy Association, the end of serfdom and the subsequent decline of manorial control demanded new forms of labor coercion suited to an era of free labor. And this was, of course, a global problem throughout a kind of European and American plantation belt. Association members recommended encouraging smallholding as a way to keep agricultural workers on the land, and some hope to deproletarianize some German workers, German industrial workers. This all amounted to a kind of welfare conservatism, caring for workers to preempt more radical social democratic change. Weber's first contribution to the Social Policy Association was synthesizing its work on free labor and rural migration with Prussian state concerns about the, quote, the so-called Polonization of its eastern provinces. Weber presented the Polish migrant agricultural workers as both a political and a racial threat to Germany. The migrants came to Germany, Weber explained, pushed by a, quote, dark urge for personal freedom. Weber was anxious that the swarm of Eastern nomads would bring German workers down to the level of the Polish proletariat. Weber described how German farmers who left the land were being replaced by a rapidly growing mass of foreign laborers with lower standards of living, end quote. Weber worried that German workers would be brought down to what he perceived as the low standards of the Polish workers with whom they had to compete. It is not possible, Weber explained, and I quote, to allow two nations with different bodily constitutions, differently constructed stomachs, to compete freely as workers in the same area, end quote. Weber thus called for the, quote, absolute exclusion of the Russian-Polish workers from the German East. When Weber assumed a professorship at the University of Freiburg, his 1895 inaugural address presented the struggle between Germans and Poles in Prussia as, and this is an important quote, an economic struggle for existence shaped by the physical and mental race differences, the physical and mental Rassendifferenzen between nationalities, end quote. The Polish farmer was winning the economic struggle with the German, Weber explained, and I quote again, not despite, but rather because of his low physical and mental habits, end quote. This was a kind of pessimistic social Darwinism where the supposedly inferior thrived by virtue of their inferiority, in Weber's view. Here, as in much of Weber's work, Weber was faced with the problem of balancing a social scientific neutrality with a commitment to German nationalism, including anti-Polish racism. In his Freiburg address, Weber raised the question of politics and value neutrality that would continue to preoccupy him throughout his career. After all, how could an economist decry labor practices the employment in agriculture of migrant laborers who happened to be Polish that were in themselves consistent with economic rationality. Economics, Weber explained, was in itself international and therefore could not provide a basis for nationalist judgments. However, once particular economists were asked to make value judgments, Werturteile, they were necessarily caught up in the, quote, economic struggle of nations, end quote. In this case, the struggle between the, quote, German farmer and a lower race. Economists had, Weber explained, to look beyond the day-to-day politics of the temporarily ruling powers and classes to the permanent power political interests of the nation. They had ultimately to concern themselves with expanding, this is a famous quote, the amount of elbow room that we, that is the German Empire, win in the world, end quote. Here Weber seems at first to contradict the well-known doctrine of value neutrality he later expressed in his lecture, Science as a Vocation. In fact, Weber's notion of values in social science remained oriented to power politics. Particularly values like nationalism and Eurocentrism were not in themselves scientific, but they were nonetheless foundational to the practice of individual scientists. This is also why, in the preface to A Sociology of Religion, Weber could claim that the civilization of the West was universal, but only in the view of the West itself. The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, first published as articles, as I'm sure you all know, in 1904, presented Weber's initial solution to the problem of labor discipline that also concerned his colleagues in the Social Policy Association. If Poles were a swarm of Eastern nomads marked by an inferiority stemming from physical and mental race differences, Western Europeans were marked by a Protestant culture that made them highly disciplined and reliable workers. Economic motivations could not, by themselves, increase the productivity of workers, for only a, quote, feeling of responsibility could lead workers to stop asking how to get a job done with the maximum of comfort and a minimum of achievement and begin to pursue work, and again, quote, as if it were an absolute end in itself, that is, a profession, Beruf. Such a feeling, according to Weber, is, quote, not something occurring in nature, but rather a result of Protestantism and its long after effects. Protestantism did not merely teach workers the commonplace that, quote, doing good work, even with poor wages, was something that pleased God, but more importantly gave workers the, quote, psychological motivation that this work was a calling and was the superior, perhaps the only means of achieving salvation, end quote. Such explicitly theological motivations became unconscious compulsions as the external technical apparatus of industry replaced internal religious motivations as the driving force behind capitalist behavior. Humans found themselves enclosed, famously, in a shell hard as steel, a stahlhartes Gehäuse, that's Talcott Parsons' iron cage, possibly not to be released until, quote, the last ton of fossil fuel has been consumed and the material apparatus of capitalism collapses. This conclusion has perhaps a gloomy tone, but I would argue it's not a critique of capitalism. Read in the context of the concerns of the Social Policy Association about labor discipline, it also presents a solution to an important problem in their field. It is one based not on specific state policies, so there you may be differing from the Policy Association, but rather on a notion of civilization that has, in Weber's view, at least a likely basis in biological race. Weber would continue to develop this strain of his thought in his 1908-09 essay on the psychophysics, as he called it, of industrial labor. In that essay, Weber recommended studying the economic efficiency of ethnic, cultural, professional, and social groups for various industrial employments, much as one might consider the profitability of a variety of coal or other raw material, end quote. In psychophysics, Weber returned to his earlier interest in race from the emphasis on religion that characterized his work on the Protestant ethic. Present-day sensibilities about racism might lead us to think that it makes enormous political difference whether Weber thought that these differences were based on immutable cultural or immutable racial characteristics. But I think that this does not accurately reflect the pre-World War I milieu. Oh, I thought I had... dear, I wonder... all right. I'll just take 2 minutes if that's okay enough. Thank you. Weber developed a paradoxical, non-universal conception of universal history, a kind of relativist Eurocentrism. For Weber, the civilization of the West was the sole universal civilization in the world, but this, he proclaimed from the outset, was only from its own perspective. Weber's non-universalism made the relationship of Europe and its others a matter of political decision by the West. The West did not present a pinnacle of evolution towards which non-Europeans should aspire. Rather, others remained other, and European states and employers could choose among several options in dealing with them. They might follow Weber's call from the 1890s for the absolute exclusion of the Russian-Polish workers, or they might follow Weber of the psychophysics and select employees from particular ethnic groups as they might select a particular, quote, variety of coal ore or other raw material. Weber reflected a world divided into zones of inequality in which European states and businesses operated as they chose. To conclude, 50 years ago, at a 100th birthday self-conference for Weber in Heidelberg, Jürgen Habermas aroused much discussion and dissension by identifying the fascist legal theorist Carl Schmitt as a, quote, legitimate pupil of Max Weber. I would be glad if I could add to our discussion today by suggesting in a similar matter that conservative U.S. political scientist Samuel Huntington is also a legitimate pupil of Max Weber. Like Weber, Huntington is both a relativist in that he does not seek to impose what he calls the West on other parts of the world. Like Weber, he is also a universalist in his certainty of the superiority of the West. And I won't discuss Huntington more there. Many scholars have criticized the Eurocentrism of the kind of universal history developed by Max Weber. Dipesh Chakrabarty's provincializing history is paradigmatic in this regard. It is nonetheless still very much worth returning to Weber's earlier, more laudatory presentation of Eurocentric universal history. Perhaps no thinker has so clearly specified the concrete imperial power political decisions central to this still powerful conception of universal history. Weber was not afraid to name these politics. Indeed, he enthusiastically endorsed them. We also should not shy away from naming these politics, even if we choose instead to repudiate them. Thank you, and thank you for letting me go over just a little bit.
Thank you. I'm going to make a brief remarks on Gurminder K.Bhambra's comparative historical sociologies or connected sociologies. Mainly, I'm going to reduce the comments on two sections, connected sociologies or connected societies, and a second one called Weber in connected sociologies, and finally a few remarks on ideal types and method. One of the questions I have is, should we talk about connected sociologies or should we talk about connected societies? Gurminder K.Bhambra seems to us depart from the existence of connected societies. Perhaps we could pose the question as something like, to what extent were societies around the world connected before the European expansion? Which societies were connected, and which societies were connected in a significant way? This is an interesting historical empirical question, which is, by the way, not Weber's question. I wonder whether there was so much contact between civilizations, and I know Gurminder doesn't accept that there is something like a civilization, that we need an alternative. I will work with this concept of civilization. So there were contacts between Muslim and Hindu civilization, yes. For instance, were there contacts between Ethiopia and the Mali Empire in East and West Africa? As I said, these are historical and empirical questions. What I want to say, and unfortunately I'm going to adopt the role of an advocate of Max Weber, a role which I don't like. But I don't mind Weber by himself. It's not that I think that he's God, as someone said in the previous session. But I'm interested in having good funding to conduct empirical social research, good funding to discuss social sciences. Anyway, I wanted to remark that Weber, as an economic historian, as a political economist, does apply knowledge on cross-civilizational contact, even if only on an occasional basis. For instance, it is obvious from reading the general economic history that he knows, for example, quite a lot about circulation of precious metal across civilizations, and not only in early modern times. The most famous case is Mexican gold in China, which arrived across the Grado de Manila, but also in antiquity, Roman gold in India. He compares, in other words, civilizations not so much spatially, but across time. For instance, he makes one of his crucial arguments about the history of law, of continental law, is that the early modern Europeans resuscitated Roman law and turned the ethic to something useful for them. So he's comparing civilizations across time. Another example is the survival of Jewish aptitudes, ancient Judaism aptitudes toward magic, toward Zauber. In the second section, I wanted to discuss, as I said, Weber in Gurminder's connected sociologies. In several respects, I don't agree with the description she makes of Weber's scholarship. One of the problems is to focus on modernization theory and on scholars like Eisenstadt, who has many merits, but his use of Weber has been questioned. It was an interpretation of Weber strongly mediated by the circumstances of US political science in the 1950s and 60s. This is a longer story we can discuss afterwards, and we will discuss afterwards in the next panel. Apart from the problem with modernization theory and Eisenstadt, I think we should try to avoid accounts like portraying Weber as someone interested in Protestant Reformation as the reason why capitalism appeared, because the argument is actually much more complicated, and there is a combination of causes, legal, scientific, institutional reasons why capitalism appears in Western Europe or North America. And the capitalism is also an important word because Weber was not so much interested in modernity as such, and he almost only wrote a couple of pages on modernity. His interest was how did capitalism, modern capitalism, appeared. It's not so much, it's not so important for him, or at least he thinks he has fewer things to say about modernity. Then there is another issue I will argue with the way we read Weber, because given the size of the number of pages he published, it's really difficult to deal with the whole of it. But in a sense, I think we should, among other reasons, because we have now much more material as a result of the collected works. Part of these materials are not only the letters, but the materials contain also lectures. And in the lectures, you can see that he had considerably more knowledge of non-European civilizations than what we thought he did. 3 or 4? Okay. Just a few remarks on ideal types. And of another important concept, value relevance, where I took, in my view, and now I'm going to quote Gurminder, any criticism of that selection of narratives that amount to European modernity, in terms of significant histories that may be omitted in the constitution of the type, can be reflected by arguing that what is being proposed is a new set of value-relevant concerns. In my view, that kind of objection is appropriate because it's simply an application of the principle of autonomy in scientific inquiry, put in very plain words. You pose a question, you deliver the answer. So you choose your standpoint, you make it clear, and you pose your question. And we can, in my opinion, we can't work in any other alternative manner. In just to finish, I had several issues with the way you describe ideal types. Perhaps it's because there were many interpretations of what ideal types are, but in my view, they are not interpretations, but they are concepts that encompasses descriptive and causal elements. And I think they are used for heuristic purposes, and I take an example suggested by Eduardo Weiss, the ideal type of the religious man in the Protestant ethic, or the ideal type of Franklin, also in the Protestant ethic. And just to finish, I will even say that there are multiple modernities in Weber. For instance, there is a socialist and there is a capitalist modernity. Both of them are bureaucratic, but there are two modernities. Just to finish, as a brief remark, I think that Weber was not only very skeptic about the blessings of European modernity, as you can read at the end of the Protestant ethic, but he was also personally an anti-modernist, something which you can appreciate when you think of how much he hated urban life, just like Simmel, and he always preferred to stay in those small places like Heidelberg or Munich. Even Vienna was too much for him. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to be here, and congratulations for the organization of this whole conference. Well, I have two sets of comments to Andrew's paper, one related to the concept of universal history. Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me now? Now? It's okay now? Okay. Well, so one set of comments about, one brief comment is about the concept of universal history, and the others are related with the problem of race in the work of Weber. So the first point is actually a question, very simple question, which is what exactly Weber understand for universal history? Because when I read the title of your paper, I tried to read something about it, and it was there is not much about it, at least in English literature. One illuminating note that I found was in Stephen Calvert's translation of the Protestant ethic to English, that he said that this concept of universal history referred in 19th century historiography to a historiography that wanted to avoid specialist studies and instead attempted to offer a synthesizing portrait of an entire epoch or era of culture. And the term does not imply world history. These are the words of Calvert. So for me, I don't know if this brings something to the table, that we need to understand exactly what was the meaning of that term in Weber's work. So I wonder if you can say something about it, if you have made some research in that regard. The rest of my comments are related to the other topic, which is was part of your talk now and is a larger part in some of the writings that informed your talk today that you sent to the participants of the conference, which is about all this racist language in Weber, which is something kind of one of these embarrassing truths about a founding father, right? I was feeling like one of these family reunions when someone said at the end, well, you know, your grandfather was an alcoholic. I would rather not know about it, but now we know and we have to deal with that, right? But for me, the question would be, what are the consequences of this, and what is the extent of that part of his thought into the larger work? So in one of your articles in Decolonizing Weber, you said, and I quote, and here are 3 ideas that I want to say something about. You say, Max Weber was an imperialist, a racist, and a social Darwinistic nationalist. And these political positions fundamentally shaped his social scientific work. And a little bit later you say, Decolonizing Weber means above all assessing the work of the work of repression required to make his thought support political and social scientific positions that were not that of his own. So the first part, I think I can agree. You present the case, I think, solidly with the information. Weber was an imperialist, a racist, and a social Darwinistic nationalist. But the second part for me is a little bit, I'm more skeptical about it, which is, you say this position fundamentally shaped his social and scientific work. And for me, that part of your argument is not as clear to what extent this part of his thought shaped his scientific work. I don't see it that clearly, or to what extent that really is the most important question. And finally, going to the political part of it, I'm not sure if we have to get linked necessarily with his own political commitments. I think we don't need to attach ourselves to his own political commitments. So let me just start saying that we can assume your characterization of Weber as this neo-racist, as you call it. But what can we do with that? What should we do with that? I sympathize with your attempt to unearth Weber's imperialist past and to show a more complex picture of his work and legacy. On the other hand, while I was reading your articles, I had the impression that in the process of presenting your point, you are reducing Weber to an imperialist and to a cultural racist. But I think we should have like a broader picture. I was not convinced that Weber political positions tainted the core of his sociological ideas. And I think this has a kind of a risk because, I mean, your work and the writing of it is very polemical, and I mean, I responded to that obviously. But you are obviously putting some labels on Weber, right? And as a sociologist, we know that labels are sticky and that they have consequences. So we don't know yet how much those labels that you put on him are going to stay, and for how long, or how much echo they will have. But you know, for me, one of the risks is that we have already sent too many great sociologists to the dustbin of intellectual history using labels that are more or less fair. You know, like you know, Spencer was an evolutionist and Comte was like a crazy positivist 19th century thinker, stuff like that. And I mean, we simply have forgotten them almost completely, and there is in those works a lot of things that have to be ought to be rescued. And obviously it's not the case with Weber now, but you never know, right? And what I want to say probably is that great scientific and political works are multivocal and they're very malleable. So there is a problem with interpreting the whole work of a thinker using them as main key of interpretation, his or her political opinions, right? So while I was reading, I was thinking, probably in the case of Marx, when you read Marx's comments on colonialism, his writing on the British role in India, when he started talking about this superior civilization and India could not escape the fate of being conquered. Obviously it's very problematic, but can we reduce Marx to that? Should avoid reusing some of his concepts or ideas for social critique? I don't think so. We still can use it in some other ways and just disregarding that part that is, problematic today. And I don't think that we should, marry to his political commitments either. We can just select what is pertinent for us today. So why cannot we adapt better to our own values and necessities? I think that's something completely valid. If we want to question the position of people like Samuel Huntington, we don't need to think better with him, right? I understand the link, and it's illuminating to have it, but I think we can even use part of Weber to criticize Huntington. That's also where that would be like the last part of my comments. That also goes with the variants, as you call them, like the further interpretations of Weber, and I'm referring again to one of your articles, that you kind of divide like the sort of good interpreters like Mommsen and Marcuse that put Weber to the right, and then disregard some other interpretations as Rehan Berdix and Günter Roth, and you say that it was something like wrong to try to use Weber from a liberal point of view, and that for me is part of the things that I see that are a little bit problematic in your paper, that probably you can say something about it.
You just wanna be understood. You just wanna be guiltless if you could. Don't be ashamed, 'cause miscalculations